Welcome to week 5 of Political Ideologies. This is part 1 of a part 2 lecture on Niccolo Machiavelli's historic work, The Prince. The Prince was written in the midst of the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, was a cultural movement that spanned roughly the 14th to the 17th century and began in Florence, Italy in the late Middle Ages. It later spread to the rest of Europe. Characteristics of the Renaissance, which you all may be familiar with, include resurgence of learning based on classical sources, the development of many advances including linear perspectives in painting, and widespread educational reforms. This intellectual transformation resulted in the Renaissance being viewed as a bridge between the Middle Ages and the modern era. The Renaissance saw revolutions in intellectual pursuits as well as social and political upheaval. However, it's best known for its artistic developments, including the works of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, both of whom inspired use of the term Renaissance man. The primary political dynasty during the Renaissance was the House of Medici, founded by Cosimo de' Medici, or known as Cosimo the Elder, in Florence during the late 14th century. The Medici's wealth and influence initially derived from textiles but moved into banking. The Medici Bank was one of the most prosperous and respected institutions in Europe. At one point, at least half of Florence's people were employed in some form by the Medicis in one of their branches of business. The Medici's family also produced some popes for the Catholic Church. Overall, the family dominated the city's government. They were able to bring Florence under the family's power and allow for an environment where art and humanism could flourish. They fostered and inspired the birth of the Renaissance, along with other prominent families of Italy, including the Visconti of Sforza, of Milan, and Este of Ferrara. The Medicis ruled Italy overall for about 100 years, although there were some interruptions. Cosimo's son, Piero de' Medici, stayed in power for only 5 years. He was called Piero the Gouty because a gout infected his foot, ultimately leading to his death. Unlike his father, Piero had little interest in the arts. Due to his illness, he mostly had to stay at home bedridden, and therefore he didn't do much to further the Medici control of Florence while he was in power. Rule stagnated until the next generation, when Piero's son Lorenzo took over. Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, born in 1449, was a lot more capable of leading and ruling the city. However, he neglected the family's banking business, which ultimately led to the family's ruin. He also, unfortunately, did not groom his children well for leadership. Lorenzo's son, Piero II, took over as head of Florence after his father's death. However, Piero ultimately was responsible for the expulsion of the Medici from the years 1494 to 1512. Machiavelli might have been considered a typical Italian Renaissance man. He lived a nondescript childhood as the son of an attorney in Florence. However, as a young man, he entered Florentine government as a secretary. He quickly rose in position and soon engaged in various diplomatic missions. He met many of the important politicians of the day, such as the Pope and the King of France. Until he was about 25, Niccolo Machiavelli enjoyed the life of any prosperous Italian citizen under the Medici family's rule. However, in 1494, during Piero II's rule, French armies crossed into Italy and conducted a major invasion. Over the next few years, French and Spanish armies fought for dominance over Italy. During Machiavelli's lifetime, Italy rapidly fell into disarray due to a lack of unity, and the result was that it was at the mercy of various invading armies and monarchs from elsewhere in Europe. After Machiavelli served 14 years as Chancellor of Florence, an important post in the Republic, he was exiled in 1513 when the Republic fell and the Medicis came back into power. He wrote The Prince while he was exiled. It was written in 1513, but the book wasn't published until after Machiavelli's death in 1532. The Prince was dedicated by Machiavelli to Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. It's not surprising, therefore, that The Prince both reflects and reinforces the Florentine trend towards despotism. It's basically an essay on how to maintain political power at all costs. It's considered infamous because in it Machiavelli argues that politics is not like any other form of civic life. It writes its own rules and should not be limited by other standards of behavior or morality. Although The Prince was privately circulated among Machiavelli's friends, it was not published during his lifetime. The only work he published in his life was The Art of War, a book about military science. In order to understand what application The Prince has for politics today, we need to understand a thing about the Florentine Renaissance. The city had many ironies, one of which was that there was a stark contrast between its artistic triumphs and its political achievements. It had a brilliant legacy in literature, painting, and sculpture and architecture. However, the political story of the city-state was less happy. It moved from a spirited republicanism into one-man rule or despotism. For the last 60 years of the 15th century, the city was controlled by the Medicis, first by Cosimo the Elder and finally by Lorenzo the Magnificent. These managed to transform Florence into the cultural capital of Europe, but they devastated the Medici family fortune by the time they passed from the scene in 1492. While Italy was descending into chaos, the rest of Europe was consolidating into fundamental nation-states: Europe, France, Spain, and Great Britain. The world was changing rapidly and was also becoming more violent. Machiavelli realized that Italy was slipping into crisis, and without some leadership and unity, it was going to lose its place as a major center of power in Europe. Machiavelli was ultimately right. It was 350 years or so before Italy would unify, and during that time it was often the victim of outside power plays. Machiavelli recognized that this disorder and disunity in Italy first and foremost put the people at risk, at the mercy of their stronger neighbors. He wanted a leader that would unite Italy and provide the stability that Italy needed to be able to defend itself against outsiders. The Prince is a call for that kind of leader, an attempt to inspire somebody, if not the Medicis, to recognize the need for action and to have the understanding of leadership qualities necessary to succeed. Machiavelli is known often for being the ultimate realist, someone who says we should not try and figure out how people should be, but we should begin to accept and deal with the world as it actually is. Realism in international relations is a school of thought that prioritizes national interest and security rather than ideals, social reconstruction, or ethical behavior. One of the foundations of The Prince is that Machiavelli's ideas are normative. They explain how things are, rather than idealist, trying to explain how things should be. For example, in chapter 15, Machiavelli notes, "It being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, i.e., that shall be useful to leaders, it appears to me more appropriate to follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities which in fact have never been known or seen, because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live." This is a direct reference to works like those of Plato, whom we read in the last couple of weeks, who posited idealist, normative views of philosopher kings who would rule through virtue. Machiavelli thinks that this is a dangerous delusion, since the idea of the philosopher king ignores what is the reality of the human condition, that humans are in fact brutal, selfish, and fickle. We might compare this to the debate that takes place in the Republic, Book 1, between Socrates and Thrasymachus. Rule by the stronger. Machiavelli introduces an is and ought to be distinction, and in doing so, he dismisses a traditional form of political philosophy, thinking about what ought to be, saying it's perhaps interesting but not very useful. Trying to live by what ought to be ignores what actually is and will only lead to ruin. Machiavelli and Plato both saw states that were in crisis. They were culturally strong, but they were declining in power and susceptible to outside forces. Plato's solution to this was to take the idealistic route. What kind of republic would be most strong and virtuous in the face of these incursions? Machiavelli takes a realist route. What is the pragmatic way that we can fend off our enemies and restore order and stability? Please go on to part 2 of the lecture for a further discussion of this week's reading, Machiavelli's The Prince.